Well, welcome back to Quest Academy, and we want you to know that we intend this to be short-term, easily accessible, dynamic learning environments that richly invest in your understanding of foundational elements of the Bible and of a biblical worldview that are applicable to real life in the 21st century, which is something we desperately need right now. In this particular part of Quest Academy, we're calling the Issachar Project, because the Issachar Project is built on the understanding out of 1 Chronicles that the men of Issachar, really the tribe of Issachar, they were people who had understanding of their times with a knowledge of what Israel ought to do. In other words, they understood what was going on around them in the world, but they also understood what God was doing and what God wanted them to do and how to connect the two. And that's what we want to be about in the Issachar Project. So it's going to be a philosophical and a theological framework for dealing with cultural conflicts that swirl all around us. And in fact, they swirl inside of us, and we struggle with what to do. And so, as I said before, there is a man named Thomas Trahamy, who was an English pastor in the 1600s, who I think very wisely said, "Nothing is so easy as to think, so nothing is so difficult as to think well." And so we want to be people who think well about the issues of our day. So this circle right here represents all of our lives that we live and the issues that we deal with in the context of our communities and in our culture. And so in the middle of that is an issue. It could be almost any issue, right? But we'll put this right in the middle. And in fact, these are some of the issues that do swirl around us. And there's all sorts of them here. And there are a lot more. We just couldn't fit them on the screen. But what I want to say today is, as we look at an issue, any particular issue, we have to put it in a philosophical context. Now, around that issue, there are a variety of dimensions. Some have just a few. Others are a little more complicated. Others even more complicated than that. All these different dimensions of the issue. Now, on top of those dimensions, there are stories. So these pyramids represent the stories that go along with those dimensions. And we all have stories. And these stories are very, very important. So these stories illustrate a particular dimension of the issue. Now, let's change the word, or just add maybe a descriptive word before stories, and we'll call it an anecdotal story. Now here's what an anecdotal story is. It's a depiction of a scene or a situation suggesting the substance of that story. You see, it's an attempt to represent that scene or situation accurately, at least from our own experience. And these are good. These are necessary. And there may be dimensions on one side that have an anecdotal story. And there may be dimensions on the other side of an issue that have anecdotal stories. They're real. And they describe what it is all about, especially as we see it from our own vantage point. Now, let's change that word anecdotal, because there's another kind of story that's happening in our culture. It's called an anecdotal story. And an anecdotal story is this. It's a depiction of a scene or a situation, just like the other one, attempting to do this, though. It attempts to deny, diminish, or dismiss particular dimensions of the issue that do not fit our preferred narrative or our own limited experience. So just picture it for a second. An anecdote is something that you would maybe take when you got a snake bite, let's say a rattlesnake. And within 4 to 6 hours, it's really good that you would get an anti-venom, an antidote to neutralize the poison that you get from that snake bite. Now, an antidote in that case is really good. But an anecdotal story that tries to diminish or deny or dismiss other people actually doesn't work. It's actually incredibly unhealthy. So let's take maybe this no way sign and put it behind it. Let's both say, you know what? Anecdotal stories that dismiss and deny other people actually doesn't work. That's what we call cancel culture. If you don't agree with me, if your story doesn't agree with my story, then you don't count and we push you aside and we reject it. Now, this is happening in a massive way in our culture right now. But let's be honest. We've had cancel culture for a long time. It's part of the human nature, and it's our broken human nature that tries to put down other people, ignore them, silence them. It's happened a long time in all sorts of situations. It's happening massively right now. And we need to reject cancel culture. We hate it when we get canceled, but we ought to hate it just as much when we cancel other people, because we need to hear their stories. And so what we want to go back and say, these anecdotal stories that do describe a dimension is really important. Now, here's what happens, I think, is that you can have your own experience, let's say these over on the left here, and there are dimensions of the issue that you particularly kind of grab onto. And you have stories that represent them. They're real stories. But some of the other dimensions on the other aspects of this wheel, you may understand not at all, or maybe a little bit, or maybe a little bit more than that, but you really focus on these over here. That's human nature too, but it's probably not out that healthy. Or you can do the opposite. Here are these stories on the other side that you really grab onto and have stories for, and you don't really understand or maybe clue into all the other dimensions of an issue. Now, let's call it like it really is. Probably for most of us, our understanding of the dimensions of a particular issue are kind of spaced out. We understand some, they're not all together necessarily. Others we understand a little bit. Others we actually don't understand at all. And what happens then is on top of those things, there are these stories. Some of the stories are very clear and very pointed. Others a little less clear. Some very unclear. And this is the life that most of us live. Now, let's just say in any given issue, some are a little simpler than others. None of them are simplistic, however. There is a complexity. Some are a little simpler, let's say these three. Others are a little more complex. Still, others are far more complex. And then, what happens in that situation is this. So let me just read it for us. We are, I think, in desperate need of a biblically centered understanding of the issues of our day that can lead us towards solutions and resolutions that create reconciliation rather than division. You see, God in His Word have sound principles and blueprints for how to live and how to live well. And thankfully, God has given us His Spirit to empower us to live out His truths for the good of mankind, and therefore to honor Him. You see, secular solutions, unfortunately, can never accomplish the purposes of God that are aimed at the maximum good for all people. You see, what God wants to do is for the maximum good of every human being. That is His heart. That's the whole thing that happened in Genesis chapter 3, is they didn't believe that. And they went their own independent way. And this connection, this relationship, this fellowship with God was broken. And we're paying the price every day. Not only for their sin, but for ours. You see, we together thrive when we are functioning in sync with the expressed heart of God. Therefore, and let's make this big for a second. Therefore, it is our distinct and significant responsibility as believers in Christ, as followers of Him, to align our hearts with God's heart as revealed in His Word. The result will be a compassionate love for God and for all people that dynamically integrates grace and truth in just the right balance for each and every situation. So if we go back to this wheel with all these dimensions and all these stories, in order to understand it, well and to put it in its place, we need to be able to have a biblical framework that we can put over this. You see, let me read this again even from last week. You see, most difficult and important issues are fairly simple, but rarely, if ever, simplistic. The complexity of these issues must be understood in order to gain the clarity that leads us towards really productive resolutions. But we need to have the inclination as Christians and the ability to seriously consider the merits of various facets of these difficult issues, even when they may threaten to diminish our own personal preferred perspective. We have to entertain other thoughts, other perspectives. It doesn't mean we have to agree with everything or with everybody, but we better entertain it. We better listen. Because if we can sit down at the table and listen to each other, I'll bet we'll do better rather than canceling each other out. You see, if we fail to gain a broad and balanced understanding of any given issue, we guarantee not only an inadequate and ineffective resolution, but also the alienation of those who see the value of truths that may be embedded in opposing or unpopular views. Therefore, it's essential that we define the non-negotiable truths that frame the issues as to scope and importance. Now, this bottom, let's make it a little bit bigger too. See, here's the deal. It's our responsibility as Christ followers is to help discover, embrace, and graciously live out biblical non-negotiable truths so that God can paint a portrait on the canvas of our lives and our community, a picture that reveals and boldly proclaims the glory and the beauty of His blueprint for what life was supposed to be. Now, let's just say this. The truth sometimes hurts, and it does. But the truth that sometimes hurts should never be used as a weapon against people. Francis Schaeffer, I think, said really well in his book, The God Who Is There. He said, there is nothing more ugly than a Christian orthodoxy without understanding or without compassion. In that same line of thinking, though, there is nothing more incomplete than understanding and compassion without resolutions and solutions for a hope that God freely and generously offers us. So we both need to know the truth, but also have grace. In John 1:14, it said that Jesus was full of grace and truth, and that equals love. You see, grace by itself is a little wimpy, but truth by itself is harsh. And so together, grace and truth, like He lived out every day of His life, equals real love, and that's what we want to do. Thomas Trahamy again said, nothing is so easy as to think, so nothing is so difficult as to think well. First Chronicles tells us that the sons of Issachar were men who had an understanding of their times and had knowledge of what Israel was supposed to do. That's what we want to be, understanding our times and understanding what God is all about. We want to be relevant to our day, and we want to be relevant to Him. Therefore, let me just wrap up with this. Therefore, we all need to do the difficult work. And don't be mistaken. It is really hard work. But we want to do the difficult work of thinking and of thinking well. And also of loving and of loving well. And in order to understand the times in which we live, so that as Spirit-filled followers of Christ, we can know how to think, how to love, and what to do. So, on some of these scattered Tuesdays, we're going to have the Issachar Project. And let me just say this in closing. Clearly, a Judeo-Christian perspective has increasingly fallen out of favor. And admittedly, some Christians have at times dealt with difficult issues without being well-informed or even well-intentioned. That has caused an unfortunate and unnecessary pain for many, many people. However, contrary to our devolving culture, we believe that God and His Word remain the real source of love and of a life that actually works. Therefore, we will try to equip you with insights on how to think through the important issues of our day using a biblical framework, because we are convinced that God's blueprint for life is cohesive. It fits together. It's consistent. But it's also comprehensive. It reaches from top to bottom, from side to side, in the depths of life. And it is satisfying for the human soul. That's why we want to do the Issachar Project. Join us in a couple of weeks. We'll start building a biblical framework, a worldview framework that we can now use as we address the different issues of our day. You guys, thank you. Love you. See you in a couple of weeks.